Welcome back everyone. In the last video we took a deeper dive into how the login and logout feature works in this React web chat app. Today we're going to look at the invite friend feature of this application. This time though, the code overview will also include looking at the Java backend which receives HTTP requests from React. Okay, now let me go ahead and do a quick demo of this invite friend feature working. So here I am in my React application. Let me go ahead and click login. It's going to take me to KeyCloak where I need to authenticate against. And let me go ahead and click on this invite link and type in the user I want to invite. Okay, see that it's successfully sent. Do note that I also started the Java backend here. I did run this on an Apache Tomcat server, so this was able to handle the HTTP request. So now this email was successfully sent, or to say the friend request is successfully sent to this email. And now when I log on to that email, you'll see that I actually got a invite request here. You don't have to worry about this spam message here. This is just because it doesn't understand or recognize the email that it's coming from or the service it's coming from, but this is my application. And you can see that an invite link was sent with this actual URL over here. Okay, now let's take a quick step back and let's look at the main app.jsx file where we can see that the invite friend and invite accepted features are first listed here. And you can see that there are several routes here, and you can see that there's a route for the invite friend and invite accepted components. And you can see that the element that's referenced is indeed the invite friend and invite accepted. So if the URL invokes invite friend, then it'll basically bring up this component, and same thing with the invite accepted. Now notice over here that in the invite friend route, that within this component being basically associated to this path, notice that we have two props being passed in. Well, there's three, but let's just focus on two. The logout URL and the KeyCloak object. And if you recall, the KeyCloak object here, which is say the props being passed in, is this props.parent KeyCloak object. And if we go to the index.js file, you can see that the KeyCloak object is basically referencing the KeyCloak that we have running. So we have the KeyCloak running on this URL. Here's the realm that the application is being authenticated against and the client ID. Now if we go to the invite friend page and the JSX, which I actually have over here, and let me go back to the application over here, it's the invite friend page, and let's go down to the render method. Here's the HTML that's generated that you see on the actual React application in the web browser. You can see that there are two input types. One is the text field and one is the submit button. So if we go back to the application here, you can see here's the input field and a submit button. Now if you look at the code here, you can see that for the text field, there is a onChange event that is associated to the function handle change. And right now this really doesn't do anything. I could pretty much just take this away, but just so that you're aware, all it's doing is basically displaying what's inputted into the text field. So nothing special right now, but I have that there. Now the more important element here is the submit function, and that you can see here that on the onClick event it is associated to the function send email invite. Now let's go to this function here real quick. Now we can see here that at the very beginning there is an if statement, which is a guard check, which basically is checking the KeyCloak object to make sure that the user is actually authenticated. So you can see here it's checking to see first if it's undefined or null, or if the authentication value is false. If so, it will basically exit this method. And then you can see that right afterwards I have a second guard statement, which is basically checking the email that was inputted into the text field. So it's checking basically what we checked over here. And I'm doing a very simple check. I'm just checking to see if the length is like at least 10, and if it's not, it also exits. Of course, this is a very basic email check. You can add your own code to verify that this is more valid by seeing if there's the @ symbol plus other checks. And then we can see here on line 200, I do invoke the setState function, which sets the class variable was email sent to true. And this variable here, was email sent, is actually used in the render method to actually help determine whether to display if the email was successfully sent or not. So if I scroll down real quick, you can see here in the render, you can see that the value of this is associated to the rendered email sent. And you can see there's an if, else if check where this boolean is basically used. And depending on this and another boolean, it'll basically say if the email was actually sent or if it was not successfully sent. So let's go back up to the send email invite, and we can go over here and see that right after that check, or right after we invoke that function, we do create a form data object and we fulfill it with two values, one being the user's email that we're inviting, and also the current user's keycloak subject, which is basically the unique ID. And then we have the fetch statement over here, which does the HTTP request to the Java backend, and we're doing this to the web app endpoint. And if we scroll up to the top, we can see that this endpoint is set to this URL path, which is the Java web application backend that's running on the Apache server. Now let's go ahead and look at the Java backend. So if we go over here and let's open up the web XML, you can see that I have an invite request servlet name that maps to this class. And actually, if we scroll down a little bit more, we can see that this servlet name is mapped to the URL invite request. So we can actually see that that maps to the URL endpoint here in the React application. You can see it's referencing the localhost 8080 React chat app backend invite request. So this means that this is going to be handled by the class invite request Java that you can see here. So let's go ahead and go over to this file. Now we can see here that in the main process request, the first thing it's going to do is extract the data from the form data object created in the React application. And you can see that here in this try with resources statement, that it's going to basically parse out the data and it's going to extract the requestee and the requester information. And the requestee, once again, is just the email of the user that you're trying to invite, and the requester data is actually the unique keycloak ID associated to the person who's logged in, who is doing the invite. And here at lines 90 and 97, we're basically doing another guard check, and we're basically making sure that both the requester and the email to invite variables are not empty. If they are, it basically sets this JSON object and responds back to the React application. Now, starting at line 109, the next thing we do, as long as we actually have a valid requester and email to invite variable that is read in from the data form object, the next thing that we do is check to see if this user already has an invite request. Because one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to spam a user. If I wanted to send them 20 invite requests, we don't want to do that. So here we're doing a quick check into the invite table in the Postgres database that I have set up, and we're making sure if something is returned with this condition, which is basically give me everything from invite where the requester equals the question mark, which is a parameterized string, and requested equals this, and accepted equals false. So I should restate what I said before. It will not resend an invite if the user actually received it and accepted it. So you can see here now that we're fulfilling the parameterized string variables. So we're putting in the requester, which is going to fill in this question mark, and we're filling in email to invite, which is going to fill in the second question mark here within this query statement. So once we get this set up and we execute the query, you're going to see that we're going to be in this while statement, and if something is actually returned, then we know that the friend request still exists. And then if we look at line 120, we do another check to see if the friend request exists equals false, and if it does, we're going to actually insert into the invite table. And this insert is going to basically have the requester and the requestee information. Once we do that invite or insert into that invite table, what we're going to do next is do another select statement. And we're going to do this from the same invite table. And we're going to be selecting the request ID, which is just a unique ID in this invite table for this unique invite request. So we're going to select the request ID from this table where the requester and requestee and accepted equals false, and I should say requester equals the requester variable value that we parsed from the request, also the requestee, which is also parsed from the request, and the accepted equals false. And now we go ahead and extract that value from this query from the database. And now after all of this, now we're finally going to send an email. And you can see an email object being created here where we pass in email to invite. And if we go ahead into this constructor, you can see that it's basically setting up a properties variable. So we're putting some SN2P variables. And then you can see that the string email to invite is being set to a local class variable called to. Now going back over here, we can then see that the next line is that we're invoking the send email method, and we're passing in the unique request ID of this invite. So let's go ahead and open this up. You can see here that the body variable within actually has this text invite leak sent to, and then you have the request ID. Now if you recall, this is exactly what we saw in the email that I showed you earlier today. So if I go back to the Gmail, you'll see that I got this specific text where the RID, which is request ID, equals 18. So this is the 18th unique email invite or invite request from this app. So this request ID is very important because when the user receives the invite email, they'll have to click on this link as part of accepting the invite. And knowing the request ID here being put as the part of the query string parameter, this RID helps the system know which invite got accepted. So lines 114 and 117, here we basically get the SMTP user and password for our Java web application to send an email using the AWS Simple Email service. And one thing I didn't mention before, but yes, we are using the AWS SES service to actually send emails. And as an FYI, here is the Amazon SES dashboard. And through here, you can actually create or set it up so that you can actually send emails using AWS's SES. Now, going back to the application, you do see that I have this line here, secrets.getSecret. So this is using code to extract this information from AWS Secrets Manager API. So AWS Secrets Manager is a place where you can actually store, basically passwords, important information, and it's actually encrypted there, so no one can actually see what it is. So if we go over there one second, here you can see I have a few secrets stored over here. And the secret name that we're trying to extract is SMTP user credentials. So you can see over here, this is what it's trying to get the username and password for. So you won't see it by default here, the actual values, but this is what this code is trying to do. So this secrets.java file get secret code is basically extracting the username and password for us to be able to use the SMTP, or say AWS SES service. And the rest of this code here is basically finalizing the sending of the email. And you can see here we do have a Boolean variable that's associated to this method that does get returned. You can ignore this. This is just debug logging here. So if it was successful in sending the email, it will be true. If it's false, then that value will be returned as well. And this is important because the React web application needs to know if the email was sent or not to be able to display that correctly to the user. So now if we go to the invite request Java file, you can see that Boolean value is returned to this local Boolean, and then we can see that that's put inside the JSON object email sent status, and then it puts the Boolean value and then the whole JSON object is actually returned back to the React application. Okay, at this point we're done with the Java code for sending an invite request, so let's go back into the React code. So if we go back to the send email invite function, let's go look to where it's handling the response back. So you can see it's handling the response back over here. And if we look specifically at line 223, you can see that it's parsing out the email sent status, and it's using the set state function, and it's going to be assigning that Boolean value to the class variable invite status. So now if we go back to the render method, we're going to see how this invite status is used. And it's right here. You can see that this invite status is then set to this const render invite status. And if we look at that, you can see that this is the other Boolean variable that was mentioned before that is used to determine which HTML to actually display to the user. So it'll basically say if the email was successfully sent or not. And you can see that these email text, or I should say the HTML text, is set to a variable called email status HTML, which in the return function here you can see that it being referenced here. So underneath the submit button is where we're going to display the HTML text. So we can do a quick demo of this with breakpoints. So what I'm going to go ahead is open up the developer console and go to debugger, and let me just kind of go out and into the invite page, and let me go ahead and put a breakpoint. Let me open up the correct file actually, the invite request. Let's put a breakpoint into the send method that we saw before. Okay, perfect, here we go. So let me just go ahead and type in, I guess, the same email. And let me go ahead and put a breakpoint into the responses returned from the Java backend. Hit submit. You can see it gets over here because this function is associated to the onClick event for the submit button. And you can see that the keycloak authenticated variable is true. So this first guard check, which checks to make sure that it's basically true, is satisfied. So it skips over, I should say it's not satisfied. This if check, I should say, checks to see if the authenticated variable is defined, null, or if it's set to false. And if so, it exits. But since it's true, which is good, then we know that the user still has a valid session, so we continue next. And we can see that we're checking to see if the email is at least 10 characters long, which it is. We then set the set state of was email sent. And then you can see here we're about to actually create the form data object with the information we want to send to the backend. And let's go ahead and just kind of skip through this. Let's go ahead and put F8 to resume. You can see it's getting into these breakpoints here. And let's go ahead and look at the response. And you can see that part of the JSON response, let's go ahead and just open this up some more. Status says success, but the reason it actually shows that the friend request already exists, so it's not making an insert into the database again. And we can see that the email sent status is true. So let's go ahead and just kind of skip through. And then you can see here that the text email successfully sent is what is displayed. Okay, now that we sent the email, let's look at the code where the user clicks on the email link. And if you remember in the Java application here in the email section, you can see that part of the URL that's actually sent as in the body references the invite accepted path of the React application. So if we go into the React's component for invite accepted, which we have over here, we'll notice a few things. When the user clicks on this, and this is what's displayed to the user, one of the first things that's going to happen is that it's going to invoke the component did mount function, which basically gets called once the page is loaded. And you can see here that we basically call a handle load function. And then if we go to the handle load function here, It then invokes another function called user login register. And let's go ahead to user login register. And let's notice something interesting within this function. See how it's parsing out the value for the RID query parameter string? This is the unique request ID of the invite. And see how as part of this keycloak init function that's right afterwards, you'll see that the request ID that is extracted from the URL is actually placed in here as part of the redirect URI, where it's going to get routed to the same component, but the RID value is going to be set to the request ID. This process ID equals 100. This is just debug stuff that I was working on before, but it has no actual added features or functionality for this application, so we can forget about this. Now, once the user clicks on this, they'll be forced to actually log into this application, which is where you see this login required for the onload. And once the user is logged in, we'll basically check to see if the user is authenticated. So we have this if statement to see if it's not authenticated, and it currently does nothing. But if it is authenticated, you can see that it does a couple of things. First, it invokes the update token function of the keycloak object, and then if that is successful, it'll invoke this load data function. Now if we look at the load data function, scroll down, you can see there's a few things. The first few lines here are basically just debug statements, so you can forget about that for now. But if you actually look over here, which is important, you'll see it does a check to see if the user is authenticated, and if it is going to call this other function called update accepted status. So now if we go to this function, okay, now that we're here, we see that it's going to be parsing out a couple of parameters from the URL. One is the request ID, and as mentioned before, this process ID, this is OBE, this is not used for anything, so we can forget about that for now. Line 108 is a guard check just to make sure that we actually have a request ID value that's written from the query string. And if it is actually valid, we're going to go ahead and proceed to make another HTTP request to the backend. So right now it's going to create another form data object where we're going to send the requestee's email and the request ID. So not the keycloak ID like for the actual invite request component, but this is part of the invite accepted. We're sending the request ID of the invite. And you can see here's another fetch HTTP request function where it's going to be sent to the invite accepted endpoint. And if we look at that over here near the top, you can see that that maps to the Java Web Applications invite accepted URL. And if we go back to the web XML, you can see the invite accepted over here. It is mapped to the URL /invite request, which we saw in the React application. And we can see here that this is actually the class that's handling this servlet is this over here. So now if we look at the Java Web Application for invite accepted.java file, you can see that the first thing that it does in the process request is it invokes a function called getRequestID, which is basically going to parse out the incoming data that it was sent by the React application to get the unique request ID. So we can see that over here. It's using a buffered reader to get to invoke the getReader function of the request object, and it's going to extract the request ID. And by looking at this, it looks like it only cares about the request ID. So if we go back to the React application, we send the requestee and request ID. It looks like the requestee is not even being read in the Java backend, so this could also be ignored. And now if we scroll back up, after it gets the request ID, it does an update friend invite function call, and with the request ID passed in as a parameter. And you can see here it's actually going to be updating the invite entry, and it's going to set the accepted value to true where the request ID equals the value that was passed in. So again, this function is going to be invoked, and this SQL is going to be invoked once the user actually clicks on the link that was sent by the requester. And then this link is going to update the database to let the database know that the user did in fact invite the request. And then we basically execute the statement, and then we check to make sure that at least one row is affected, and if so, then it was successful. And so we have this JSON object where we basically set the status and the reason. And in the case that it's 1, that means we actually made a successful update, and that put this, just string text for reason. If it's 0 or default, basically no words or no rows were updated, which is a weird case, so we don't expect this to happen, but this is here just in case. And we can see that that JSON object is returned. So let's go back to the calling function, and you can see that JSON object here, and it just gets returned to the user or the React application. So now let's go back to the React application for invite accepted, and let's go ahead and look at where the code handles the response back. And you can see here basically checks from the JSON response back. It checks to see if the status indicates success or not, and if it does, it'll invoke the set state and set a class variable user authenticated to true or false. Now if we go to the render function, because every single time set state is invoked, it does basically have the render function be called again. And we can see that this user authenticated is then is set to a const is user authenticated. And this determines which HTML to show to the user. And it basically shows whether or not the invite was accepted, as you can see here, and it has a welcome text. Or if it's not true, if it's false, basically indicate that the user did not accept the invite yet. Okay, let's do a quick demo of me actually clicking on this invite request. But before we do that, I want to actually bring up the database backend. And you can see here I have a pgadmin web browser tool to actually connect to the Postgres database. But you can use whatever client that you like, that you prefer, to connect to the database that you have set up. So what I want to do is look into the invite table before I actually click on that link. Okay, so we can see here's the invite table. Let's go ahead and just search for all rows here. And here we go. Let's look at this last entry here, because this is the one that was just sent. You can see here the requester. This is the KeyCloak unique ID of the person that was logged in. Here is the requestee's email that you recall that I sent. You can see that accepted is false by default whenever you enter a new entry. And you can see that the unique request ID is actually set to 18. So if we go back to the email, you can see that the RID, the request ID, is actually sent to 18. So once I click on this link, it's going to go through this React code, which is going to do the fetch HTTP request, where we're going to send, as part of this HTTP request, the request ID. And then the Java backend is going to extract that request ID, and as we've seen in this SQL code, is basically going to just update this invite to set the accepted value to true, where request ID equals whatever was passed in. So once I click on this link over here, and if I go back here and refresh, we're going to see that this is going to become true. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's click on this link. Okay, I'm going to actually open this link up in another browser, because since I'm already logged into KeyCloak or the React application as myself in this Firefox browser, I want to open up another browser here and then just paste this URL. And you can see I actually get routed to the login screen. And why is that? If you remember, in the invite accepted, let's see over here, in the component did mount, it calls the handle load. And if we go to handle load, calls the user login register, and if we go to that function, you can see that one of the first things it does is make sure that the user is logged in. And if the user does not have an account, they'll be forced to basically create one over here. So if I come back over here, this user does not have an account just yet, so we can actually just register real quick. So let's just do this. Use my email. Let's create a new test user 4. Register. Now you can see the invite was accepted. Welcome to the chat application. And you can see that over here at the bottom, in the render function, you can see that that's one of the basically conditions that we have here. If user is authenticated, invite accepted, welcome to the chat app. So this is good. So if I go back to the login page here or chat page, and that is it for this invite feature. Hopefully this helped you guys understand the React Web application a little bit more. Thanks again everybody for watching. If you like what you saw, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I will put out another video shortly actually describing the chatting between the users, which is pretty much the main point of a web chat application. So, see you all next time.